Hello BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. Books this week are The Grammar Book, an ESL/EFL Teacher's Course by Marianne Celce-Murcia and Diane Larsen-Freeman. By the way, apologies, I know this camera shows things in mirror image, so I'll apologize at the beginning of the video, but that will hold true for the rest of the video. And the complete illustrated fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. So, it's been, I don't know how many of you have been following the news here in Vietnam. I'm currently living and teaching English in Vietnam, but we're entering yet another week of lockdown because of the coronavirus. You can see the hair's getting long without the haircut, and I've stopped shaving every day because I never leave the apartment. I was still teaching online, but as you know, because everybody somewhere in the world, everybody anywhere in the world has been going through this at one point. The lockdown can be a bit rough. Even though I'm lucky that I can continue to work from home, I feel like I'm spending a lot of time on the computer without really having a chance to refresh my mind. And I mention all of that as a way of making an excuse for myself because my professional development reading has really plummeted this week. I just have not been in the mood for it. I need to. I've not been in the mood for any heavy duty reading for professional development. So on this book, the grammar book, I read 6 pages this week. I had actually among my weekly duties, I do some level testing for one of the schools I work at, which means I just have to sit at my computer and then wait for the front office staff to tell me they have a student waiting, and then we go into the Zoom chat. So it's 2 hours in which I have to be at my computer, but there's a lot of downtime in there between students. And in the past, I've gotten a lot of reading done during that time. But this week, I just could not concentrate. I had one session where I had maybe about an hour of free time all told during those 2 hours. And I just was trying to read this book, and I just couldn't focus. So I got 6 pages done, reading about modal verbs and their phrasal counterparts. So it talks about how all the modal verbs have equivalent phrasal verb counterparts. It talks about the meaning of modal verbs. There's a paragraph here. It says, many linguists and semanticists have discussed modals as having at least 2 distinctively different functions. 1, an epistemic meaning, expressing logical probability, and 2, a deontic function, expressing a use related to social interaction. So, I don't know, are the words epistemic and deontic words we're expected to know? I mean, to be fair, from those sentences, it's perfectly clear what the meaning is. Because I was on the computer anyways, I was waiting for the level test. I Googled the words and checked them out in the dictionary. But if I hadn't been near a dictionary, I could have easily guessed what the meanings of those words were anyways. But yeah, I thought, okay, for something that's meant for an introduction to grammar, I don't know. Do you know those words? Are those common words? But then it gets into the meanings here. So there's 2 meanings. The logical probability. For example, someone's knocking. That must be Sydney. That will be Sydney. That should be Sydney. That may be Sydney. That could or might be Sydney. And they're ranked from order of high probability to low probability. Apologies again for this being mirror images. And then in a number of different situations, ranked for a high probability to low probability. Which is, I mean, on one hand, this is useful stuff to know, even though, as they admit, these rankings do vary a little bit from person to person or from dialect to dialect. Yeah, and then on the next page as well. But I had a really hard time focusing on these sections, and that's maybe another reason why I made so little progress this week. When I read a book like this, I really do my best to try and absorb each piece of information before moving on, saying, okay, what is the order here? What is the exact ranking? Even though I know in a couple months' time, I'm not going to actively hold any of this in my mind, which is always the frustrating thing about trying to read for professional development. If it's pleasure reading, that's one thing. You don't begrudge the time. But reading for professional development, I'm always discouraged by how little I retain after 6 months' time or so. And then they go into, I guess, the deontic function, the use of phrasal modals, which I only just barely touched. But yeah, during that hour I was devoted to trying to read this, I just kept going on Facebook or checking Twitter, or kept just getting distracted by social media, and it was lacking the willpower this week to stick with this particular book. So over to the Brothers Grimm then. The Brothers Grimm I made better progress on, not quite as much as last week, but I read 196 pages, up from page 336, which was story number 62, the Bee Queen. Sorry, the Queen Bee. All the way up through, I just finished the Jew Among Thorns. We'll talk about that one in a minute. And on to the Skillful Huntsman. So yeah, from the Queen Bee to the Jew Among Thorns, and just barely started the Skillful Huntsman. I talked a lot about my frustrations with this last week, and a lot of these frustrations are of my own making, meaning this is supposed to be my fiction reading for this week, meaning I'm trying to sit down and read through large chunks of this, but it's a collection of folk tales. It's not meant to be like marathoned through like I'm trying to do with it. So that's largely on me. But even that being said, even with all the frustrations, something maybe I didn't emphasize last week is there a number of stories in here that are quite good, where you get to the end and you're like, oh, that was a clever little story, or that met my narrative expectations perfectly. Or every once in a while, not often, because by and large these are very predictable stories, very predictable. But every once in a while, you'll get to a little story where you're like, well, that was an interesting little subversion there. I didn't see that coming. But mixed in with that are also a lot of very predictable and very cliche stories. So you're definitely taking the good with the bad in a collection like this. And with a collection like this, it's the perfect thing to read a quick story in between tasks. So like do a little bit of work on the computer and then say, okay, I'll take a 2-minute break and read a Brothers Grimm story. And it's quite nice in that regard. Although the stories are of uneven length, so it's a little bit difficult. Sometimes you're in the mood for something really short, and then the next story, as you're reading through the book, the next story is like one that's 10 pages. But a lot of them are very short, like this one here, the Fox and the Geese. The entirety of the story is just not even a page. Some of them are even shorter than that. And then some of them are longer. So, if you're in the mood for something real quick, sometimes there are lots of real quick ones together, and then you'll just be snapping through the stories, and you'll get to like a 12-page story, and you'll have to adjust. So that's another problem with trying to read this straight through. And again, the way this is meant to be read is just picking it off the shelf, letting it fall open, finding a story, reading it, enjoying it, and putting it back. That's how it's meant to be read. I'm doing it all wrong, admittedly, trying to read it cover to cover. Some of these stories, actually, let me take a step back. Almost all of these stories are stories you've never heard of. There may be, I don't know, a handful of stories that everybody knows. Little Red Riding Hood, Rumpelstiltskin, Shoemaker and the Elves, Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and The Brave Little Tailor, and probably a couple more that I'm Tom Thumb, one or two more that I'm probably aren't coming to mind at the moment. Hansel and Gretel. But, aside from those maybe 10 stories, it's a collection of 210 stories in here. So that's, 10 stories that everyone knows, and then 200 stories that you've never heard of. Although, as I've been going through here, I've recognized a couple of them from the Jim Henson Hour, which if you're as old as I am, you'll remember this from the late 80s, I believe. There was a storyteller segment. So one about Hans the Hedgehog, recognized from the Jim Henson Hour. The other one from the other one actually, about the Brother Lustig, has elements that were very similar to one of the stories in the Jim Henson Hour, although it has elements that were different. It's about a gambler, and he has a set of cards where he never loses, and he has a sack where he can tell anyone to get into his sack. I think that was Brother Lustig was definitely the one with the sack. I think it was the one with the cards as well. Or maybe the ones with the, yeah. It's a little bit hard to keep these all straight, actually, because elements will pop in from various stories. So the story about the soldier getting discharged without any way to support himself pops up in like 3 or 4 different stories. This is something I mentioned last week, how the same elements repeating themselves in the stories. And the Brothers Grimm have arranged these for whatever reason, I guess so that you can see the parallels more easily, where the stories, similar stories are arranged together in the volume. So there'll be like 4 in a row where it's like a discharged soldier. So, I guess they're not trying to hide that these are very repetitive stories. And again, this is partly a work of scholarship, among other things. I was reading The King of the Golden Mountain, story 92, which is a story I adapted for an English lesson a couple of years ago. I won't get into the details of that lesson, but I was going through the story at the time, and I was going through a version I got off of the public domain in Wikipedia, their Wiki Commons. And then as I was reading through this section, reading through the same story in this book, I was surprised at how many differences there were. For example, in the version I got off of the Wikipedia Commons, there was a fairy who was assisting the boy. In this version, there's no fairy. He doesn't get any warning by a fairy. He just gets a priest to bless him. And some other little differences like that. So that caused me to go back to Wikipedia, and it's a Brothers Grimm story. Wikipedia, I don't think, has any older versions of it, but they've got 3 translations of this into English in the public domain. And you look at them, and you can see that there are differences in each of them, which I don't know if those are strictly linguistic problems, or if the translators are adding or subtracting details to make the story their own. But at any rate, it's one of the things I'm now more aware of is how much these stories differ from translator to translator. The other thing, actually, while I was there, I found on Wiki Commons the version that was in my book. And from that, I was able to figure out who the translator of this book is. Because in the Wordsworth edition that I have here, it doesn't actually list the translator. But by cross-referencing this with the stuff in the Wiki Commons, I found out that I'm reading the version by Margaret Hunt, which was translated into English in 1884 and was entitled Grimm's Household Tales. So yeah, I've been wondering who the translator of this edition was. The other thing, if you go to Wiki Commons, is that the original book translated by Margaret Hunt in 1884 contained notes at the end, which I believe are Jacob Grimm's original notes, translated into English, of course. Either that or they're Margaret Hunt's notes. It's a little bit unclear, but I'm guessing they must be Jacob Grimm's notes, because Wikipedia often will make mention of Jacob Grimm's notes. And they're notes about where the story was from, who told it, alternative versions. And it's a pity that that's not in this volume here, because I'm a bit of a completist. If I'm doing something, I like to do it completely. And this makes me aware that even though this has all 210 canonical stories from the 7th edition of the Brothers Grimm, previous editions took stories in or out. So the 7th edition is looked to be the final version. Even though it has all 210 stories, I'm missing out on the notes. Although if you look at those notes, and I skimmed through them, they do look rather dry, and a lot of the notes have alternative versions of stories that are collected in the main volume. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm already complaining about how this book is very repetitive. The last thing I need to be doing is reading alternative versions of the same story, when it already seems to me like several of these stories are alternative versions of the same story. So, it does all appear to be on Wiki Commons from Wikipedia. So I could actually read it if I wanted to, but one of my rules is my reading time is my time away from the computer. So if I've got to go to the computer to read extensive notes, I'm just not going to read the notes. But the other thing is that Margaret Hunt's 1884 edition was in 2 volumes. And this, as you can see, is just one volume. It's 845 pages, so it's a fair amount of page count. But you can imagine if you added in the notes, and that could be 2 volumes easily. So perhaps that's why the publishers have omitted the notes, so that you could fit it into just 1 volume. The other thing is Margaret Hunt's version has an introduction by Andrew Lang. Again, I'm getting all of this from the Wiki Commons version. Andrew Lang, I reviewed one of his books in November of last year, Tales of Greece and Troy. It was a somewhat critical review, but he's somebody I'm familiar with, and it's a long introduction. I'm not sure how many pages that would run to on the printed page. It's all on it's all on Wiki Commons. So I had a look at that, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to be reading that off the computer either. I skimmed it, and it didn't seem to have any vital information in it. It seemed to be mostly commentary. So yeah, all of that is a long way of saying I've become aware this week that the version I'm reading is incomplete, in the sense that it's missing the original introduction from 1884, and it's missing Jacob Grimm's translated notes, which were in the 1884 version, but then the 1884 version was 2 volumes. Okay, another thing, I suppose I should talk about this, is The Jew Among Thorns, which I actually mentioned this in the first video I did on this book. because it's very hard to miss. You know, right when you're flipping through the table of contents, you can see, ooh, okay, the Jew among thorns. And if you flip through it, it has a little introduction by the publishers where it says, the publishers have included this story because it is a literal rendering of the Grimm's work and is of literary and historical interest. The stereotyping that it expresses is both obvious and obnoxious, and modern readers will draw their own conclusions. And I agree with that completely. It shouldn't be censored. It's historical. It's the Brothers Grimm is part of the Western canon, so don't cut it out. Include it, but then put a little disclaimer here. The stereotyping is obnoxious and obvious. That's all you need. A few sentences of disclaimer, and then go ahead and include it. Although there is a complication here, and the complication is that the Brothers Grimm is often not thought of as a work for scholars or amateur history buffs like myself. The Brothers Grimm is often thought of as a children's book. Again, via Wikipedia, there's some controversy about whether this is supposed to be a children's book, even going back to the Brothers Grimm's own day. I think the Brothers Grimm got some flack for not making it clear enough that it was not supposed to be a book for children when this first came out, because of the nature of some of these tales. Because again, the Brothers Grimm viewed this almost as a work of scholarship, preserving these tales that they were hearing. Although the public apparently, when this first came out, was not quite sure what to make of this, whether this was for children or for scholars or what. But anyways, all that is, I mean, what I mean to say is, if you think of this as a children's book, then all of a sudden, then that little disclaimer here about how it's just obnoxious and obvious, and then maybe that doesn't have as much weight. Which perhaps is why you so seldom see the complete Brothers Grimm on bookshelves nowadays. I mean, I've got this one here, but I actually had been wanting to get my hands on a complete edition for some time, and had trouble finding it. Not that I was really looking all that hard. I was just perusing bookstores when I happened to go in. If you wanted to go on Amazon and order it online, I'm sure you could. I mean, let me know what your experience is. Do you often see the complete Brothers Grimm in your local bookshop? I'm thinking you don't. And I'm guessing maybe stories like The Jew Among Thorns are why you will often see selected versions of the Brothers Grimm. I actually was on Amazon, and I was looking up Grimm's Household Tales by Margaret Hunt, which is the translation that this Wordsworth is using here. And they had it on Amazon, but it was like 530 pages. And this edition is 845 pages, and that's without the original introduction and without the Jacob Grimm's notes at the end. So I'm thinking that the version being sold on Amazon is also not a complete version, although I don't know. And then I was getting into the reviews of it, and somebody said, it's an interesting book, but it's a lot more racist than I remember. And then somebody else reacted to that review and said, the PC wokeness, they're out of control. Shame on that reviewer for saying that the Brothers Grimm was racist. The Brothers Grimm can be racist. The Jew Among Thorns is it's a racist book. It's a racist story. Now, again, via Wikipedia, and I apologize for basing all my knowledge on Wikipedia, but I'm not a scholar. I'm just somebody who reads. Wikipedia says there's some debate about whether or not these stories reflect the views of the Brothers Grimm themselves, or whether the Brothers Grimm were simply collecting these stories for the sake of completeness, and that they included it not because it reflected their own views, but just because they wanted to have, preserve the stories that they've heard. Although their collected tales did go through 7 editions in which they were putting stories in and taking stories out. So there are stories that were in earlier editions that did not make it into their final 7th edition. Puss in Boots, I think, is the most famous of those. So if we know they were taking some stories out because they didn't quite fit their vision, then leaving the Jew among thorns in is a bit more damning. And it's not the only anti-Semitic story in here. There was another one, number 7, The Good Bargain. Apparently there's one more coming up according to Wikipedia. Which one is that? I think that's one coming up. Oh yeah, The Bright Sun Brings It to Light, which story 115. I haven't gotten to that one yet. But yeah, that little exchange on Amazon, you hate to argue with just every random person who comments on the internet, which I guess is the trap I'm falling into here now. But I get actually a fair amount of comments on this channel, from people who are very angry that I'm criticizing something from a politically correct standpoint, and they said, I get accused of being like pro-censorship myself. People have accused me of being pro-censorship and get quite worked up about it in the comments to some of my videos where I'm critiquing stuff for not being politically correct. And maybe some of that is my own fault for not being clear on my communication. But, from my perspective, I am completely anti-censorship. I do not want the Jew among thorns to be censored. It's part of, it's historically and culturally relevant. It's part of the collection. But we should still have the freedom to say, okay, but some of these stories are a little bit racist, without people saying, oh, the PC police, when will you guys stop? You have to censor and ruin everything. And I'm not trying to censor this. And this goes for all of my past videos where people have gotten upset because I've criticized stuff for being racist or having this or that Western centered view. Not trying to censor it, but we can talk about it. We can talk about it even from saying, okay, we're fond of these books. That's the reason I'm spending the time talking about it on this channel. But we can still point out where it's where by today's standards it's a little bit racist, like the story about the Jew among thorns. According to Wikipedia, again, the Nazis really liked the Grimm Brothers fairy tales. Hitler was a big fan and wanted stories like the Jew among thorns taught to children. I read somewhere, I can't find it on Wikipedia now, maybe I read it somewhere else, that in the 1930s, these stories were being taught in the German elementary schools, and they said, I read this somewhere, you could hear the children laughing down the hallway when they were doing the Jew among thorns. And, I guess it would be kind of a funny story in like a slapstick, cartoonish type of way, if you could get past the whole terribly racist part of it, which of course you can't. But I was going to go into more details about the plot, but I'm about out of time here. This camera shuts off after 30 minutes. So why don't we call this good for 1 week? I'm sorry I got off on so many different tangents. There were a couple other stories in here, actually, that I had thought I would talk about, but as usual, I ramble. Sorry. I ramble on for too long. So we'll just stop the video here.